Back again. We're going to be talking about historical fiction this week, or chapter 10, whichever one you want to call it. And last week we talked about realistic fiction, and just to start off with, historical fiction is just realistic fiction, but it's just set in a time long enough ago to be thought of as history. At least we usually look at that as at least one generation, like 20 plus years or so, before the date that the book was published. So if it is a book that was published even as long ago as, let's say, 1970s or 1980s, but it was about something that happened in the 1950s or 1960s, it automatically was thought of as historical fiction. Nowadays, it's 2020, so or 2021 or whatever, it's the 2020s. And nowadays, if it was set at least in the 1990s or 1980s, very often we can go ahead and put it into historical fiction, depending upon kind of a lot of times what the subject is about. When we're talking about historical fiction for what we consider today's child, we look at it from two different sources, because historical fiction is made up of both fact and imagination. It is fiction. That's one of the things that a lot of times we get too murky with historical fiction. We start lumping biographies and things like that over into historical fiction too, but they're really not, because remember, biographies are stories about real people. They would be considered nonfiction, especially if they're autobiography by the very person. And so we kind of have to stay away from that. We also, as I'll probably mention again later on down the line, we stay away from things that are written from a journal perspective, because that's more of a primary source where it was written by someone who was actually viewing things that were going on. What we're talking about this week is purely historical fiction that we would use with children, so therefore imagination comes into play in it. It does, however, help children understand public events that we label history, as I have here. It helps children experience the private struggles that characterize the human condition. As a matter of fact, the authors of our textbook, I pulled out a little quote that comes from the authors of our textbook, and they say that historical fiction and biography offer children the opportunity to live through the experiences of the past, not just gain knowledge about these events and people. So it puts them, there comes that imagination part of it too, it puts them in situations in history that normally they wouldn't immerse themselves in. I like what the book has to say about this. One value of historical fiction for children is that it helps children judge the mistakes of the past more clearly. And I think it's George Santayana that we attribute the phrase to, of we study history so that we can more or less learn about the mistakes of the past so we don't make the same mistakes again. One book that I'm going to be talking to you about or sharing with you this week in class is Henry's Freedom Box. And it is an example of historical fiction that is actually based on a true story, but yet the author took a lot of poetic license with it. And I look forward to sharing that book because I think you'll like it. When we're talking about historical fiction for today's child, A lot of times they're learning historical fiction through like series books, like the I Survived series. These are about real events, but they are written from the perspective of a fictional child who survived those events. So therefore we put them in historical fiction. Picture story books that are from the life of a particular period. When they turned the Anne Frank story into a picture book of Anne Frank, they kind of changed it up where it wasn't dealing with his adult of a theme. It still was set during Nazi Germany, well, in the Netherlands where the Franks were, but it was redone in such a way that it used a real character but changed it up, added fiction to it. With the book I have here, like The Curse of the Blue Tattoo, that is about a kid named Jackie Faber from like the early 19th century, and Jackie is a she disguises herself as a boy and works on a ship, and it's a pretty exciting historical fiction. The book by Patricia Polacco that I have here, it's about Sadie Crosswhite and her family on the Underground Railroad. And so much of Patricia Polacco's are based on real people. Well, this one is based on a real thing like the Underground Railroad, but of course Sadie is a fictional character. Today's children tend to select realistic fiction, like we were talking about last week. Those I stories where I survived things. So if we can put them into, if we can put that into like a real setting, it can actually become a teaching thing. For example, if you put something like the I Survived a Hurricane along with a real book about hurricanes, the students are going to be learning a whole lot more, but it could also be a really good way of teaching the kids to determine the difference between fiction and nonfiction. When we're talking about the value of historical fiction, we can go a long way with that. I have here, as I mentioned earlier, it helps a child experience the past. It encourages kids to think as well as to feel. It helps us judge the mistakes of the past that I've mentioned earlier. It even teaches children to kind of see how we have always had a form of human interdependence, that throughout history, the way that we have survived has come through human interdependence. And that's even one of the social studies strands that we're supposed to teach kids according to the National Council for the Social Studies. When we're talking about types of historical fiction, an author weaves a fictional story around real events and people of the past, as I mentioned earlier. For example, there is a cute children's book called Shooting Star that is about the character Annie Oakley, who really was a real person, but it almost blows Annie Oakley into tall tale territory, where she's almost a Pecos Bill or a Paul Bunyan. But it's a beautiful story. It's fun. An author has fictional lives in it, fictional people that don't really have any reference to history, but are in a particular setting that we all know that happened. However, there are times that our fictional characters will run into real people because they are during these times. If it is set during the Revolutionary War and the character happens to run into Benedict Arnold or something like that, that doesn't take away from it being historical fiction, because it's a fictional character that is running into or crossing paths with the real person. But most of the time it's historical fiction because they're just using historical setting. For example, in Treasure Island, for goodness sake, it is all about fictional characters set during the time of pirates. When we're talking about things like the author's personal experiences that describe a time that's seen as history from their point of view, or from the point of view of the child audience, it becomes historical fiction. Whenever we're talking about more contemporary stories that endure for long periods of time, eventually they become historical in significance and very often will be considered historical fiction. But we really do have to look at the time that the story was set. Very often an author tells stories of the past in the guise of another genre. Very often, whenever we have been reading stories about, or that are considered fantasy or so forth, it's really been a story from the past that's been woven into more of a fantasy setting. But like I said earlier, when we're talking about authentic journals, those are not included in historical fiction. However, Scholastic has this wonderful set of Dear America books that look very much like real journals. They're set up to look just exactly like real journals and seem like real journals, but the characters that they have put in them are fictional. When we're evaluating historical fiction, we want kids to look at historical fiction with a critical eye. We want children to be able to read historical fiction and think it's an interesting story. So when we're looking at good historical fiction, we want it to be really rich in details. We want it to be accurate for that time and place. We want it to blend with the fiction so that the background of the story is subordinate to the story. In other words, what's going on with the fictional characters in it is far more important than is what's going on necessarily in the background. The background's just added value. Is the story kept as accurate and as authentic as possible? Is the dialogue authentic? Do they speak in the book like you would expect them to be speaking during that period of time? Does the author provide any background information to distinguish it from fact and fiction? Does the story reflect values and norms of the culture that's represented in it? How about, does the author avoid any contradiction or distortion of the known events of the story? Whenever we're looking at that, you might look at things like, again, like Henry's Freedom Box. Henry is a slave who ends up mailing himself across the lines to freedom during the Underground Railroad days. It is based on true story. The Breaking Stalin's Nose. It's about a 10-year-old named Sasha that's during Stalin's rule, who wants to be the best communist ever, but is disillusioned when his hero, who is his dad, is arrested by the communists. Domitia, that's almost like a Cinderella story, that it's very well told, it's very authentic, but it is really folklore that is set during a period of time of overbearing governors in Mexican history and so forth. When we're evaluating historical fiction, we're also looking at things like, are the background details authentic for the time period? Everyday life, the changing crops, the low wages, different things like that, are they accurate for the time period? Does it reflect the values and the very spirit of the time? Whenever we're using historical fiction with kids and we ask how can we pique the interest of our students in historical events, that's easy. We do it with authentic historical fiction. As a matter of fact, there is an article that I included in our module this week that is all about why I teach with historical fiction. I'd really like for you to take a look at that. Student interest in social studies increases a lot dramatically. I put dramatically here when their instruction includes literature. As a matter of fact, there was, I know I made a note about that somewhere, that there was a study done, and it's been about 18 years ago, something like that, trying to determine why kids had trouble with history, or why so many kids didn't like history. And the study found that, for example, 5th grade students in classrooms where historical fiction was used, along with their social studies, not only recalled more facts from history, but they also showed more enjoyment of social studies than students in classrooms that didn't bring in children's literature into the social studies curriculum. I hope you will read the article, and I hope you will give that some thought. When we're talking about other perspectives in historical fiction, the use of historical fiction does raise some concerns by some that truth and factual evidence of events shouldn't be distorted with fictional characters. But I got to tell you, I've got here that history is laced with controversy. Truth is way stranger than fiction, but actually occurred. And so very often when we have fictional characters rooted in historical times that are true, it's almost like this is too much. It's almost like this is too much to believe. It's almost like it turns it around and makes it super interesting. Throughout this chapter, there are examples of historical fiction used in the classroom where they are woven into different strands of the social studies, and you can teach a lot of different strands of the social studies. You can engage kids in a lot more discussions of history, which only increases their literacy skills. That's one of the reasons it's so important to include historical fiction in the curriculum. Very often in our classes, we use the historical fiction to teach on what we kind of consider a thematic approach to teaching. Beginning on page 139, this chapter actually begins talking about thematic teaching. And when we're talking about teaching thematically, we're talking about centering all of our teaching around, for example, a particular time period or even a particular book. And one of the great things about teaching thematically is that it causes kids to start looking at things as all learning is connected. It starts making kids think that we don't pigeonhole learning into just reading or just social studies or just science or just math. When we're teaching thematically, we're taking a particular theme and we're spreading it out across all the subjects, across nearly the whole day of teaching. And historical fiction helps us do that very easily. When we're teaching thematically, we can either put it into different topics, like human experiences that I have here, or we can teach it chronologically, where we kind of follow the social studies curriculum. And a lot of times, teachers teach social studies curriculum very often just with historical fiction, but bringing in other things to introduce the different topics. When we're talking about different classroom approaches to historical fiction, we're talking about using themes. Let's say that we decided we were going to center everything for a couple of weeks around ancient times. It could be around the times of the Romans or the Greeks. It could be around the Middle Ages. It could be around the Renaissance. It could be around exploring at sea. You can bring in examples of historical fiction in order to fit any of those different themes. Also in themes in history could be mysteries and adventure, or history's mysteries that we find throughout history. I did a unit one time with my 5th graders that they absolutely loved, where I brought in children's books about the lost colony of Roanoke, and the kids loved trying to decide or come up with their own theories about what happened to those early settlers in Roanoke back in the late 1500s to early 1600s, before Jamestown was even settled. Other strands of social studies, like forced journeys of transformation, that could be a theme that you're centering a bunch of historical fiction around. I know a lot of people who have come up with wonderful theme teaching that involved, for example, the forced move of the Native American tribes when Andrew Jackson signed the bill to have all of the Indian tribes move to this direction. Well, we more often consider that the Trail of Tears, and I've seen some really good thematic units built around that. Fear and intolerance. I've had experience myself of teaching with a lot of children's literature to teach about the Holocaust. Resistance and challenges to injustice. There are so many good books out there now about, for example, the civil rights movement, facing adversity through relationships, and so forth, the innovation, even the dawn of technology. There are tons and tons and tons of children's books that really fit into all of these different themes that are well worth using. When we're talking about other classroom approaches to historical fiction, just look at all of these that could even be used from a chronological perspective. Native Americans, colonial America, the Revolutionary era. Kids could be learning reading, or you could be doing reading lessons with children's literature that fell into any of these categories, and also be teaching social studies to kids. In our books, it talks a lot on page 141 about a teaching strategy called the Jackdaw method. And when we're talking about Jackdaw method, according to, I looked this up, according to Encarta Dictionary, a jackdaw is a noisy black bird, like a medium-sized noisy bird of the crow family. It's known for stealing things, especially shiny objects. We don't have them around here. They're native to Europe and Asia. But according to our textbook, it is used by educators to refer to a collection of concrete artifacts that connect historical books with real events of the times. In other words, we are being jackdaws. We are kind of stealing from a period of time in order to help teach a particular era of time. For example, we use newspaper clippings, we use recipes, we use maps, we use flags, we use dolls, pictures of clothing, photographs, tools, books. I have several different little artifacts that I got from doing archaeological digs in Williamsburg, Virginia, and in Jamestown that I have used with my students, that were pieces of pottery and so forth, that I consider jackdaws, that I have used in order to help connect whatever we're reading, even if it's a historical fiction book, to a particular period of time. Now, this is what I'm wanting you to do this week. I'm going to be asking you to select one of those themes or time periods that are in this PowerPoint or that are mentioned throughout our chapter this week. And I'm going to want you to do some research on your own and come up with several different books. Whenever I say several, at least 3. You can have more than that, but at least 3 books that exemplify that theme or time period. No nonfiction. We're talking historical fiction. Make sure that the books are fiction books, but that are all from a same time period or same theme, like is mentioned in our chapter. It could be that all of them are from the Revolutionary War. It could be that all of them are from the time of the Indian removals. It could be that all of the books that you put together are from the time of the Holocaust, different things like that, or the Civil Rights period, whatever. But find at least 3 nonfiction books, and then I'm going to want you to create a chart to show the way that the theme or the time period plays out in your set of books. In other words, like a picture of each of the books and a little blurb. Like in the middle, it'll be whatever your topic is, and a little blurb next to each book, and that ties it into that topic. I'm going to have some examples, as I mentioned, in our face-to-face classes to show you. But you're going to have to do a little bit of detective work on your own, kind of like you did for the little discussion question that we had last week for realistic fiction. And then you will go through our discussion posts and tell me about the books that you found. Or you, just like last week, you can kind of create a little chart, take a picture of it, load it in there, and that'll be good enough. If you have any questions, just let me know, and I hope you have fun with this week, because I always have fun with historical fiction.